All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the last class for the very first DWeb for Creators course. I am grateful that you all were able to make time for this makeup class. It's going to be a really special session, and it's bittersweet, but it's the end of this one, but the beginning of more. So looking forward to all that's to come. Few reminders for today. We do have the feedback form. Thank you to everyone who's filled it out. Of the 40 folks in class, we've only received 8 people's feedback, maybe 7. And it would be really helpful if everyone could just fill out the feedback form. It's one of the things that we included in the registration that we were really hoping that people could participate in. And I think everyone said yes whenever we had the registration. So it's a really short, it can be with 2 multiple choice questions and a few free writing, which could be a sentence if you don't have a lot of time. But input from you will really help us to shape the future and to understand how effective we were able to be with all the intentions and dreams that we put into this course. So thank you so much for making time to do your feedback form. And if you have signed up with a DWeb project, we are going to be in touch with you directly. The DWeb project document is linked there, which has the dates for the follow-up and what you can expect. If you still have a project you want to be considered, go ahead and put it in, and we will see how we can include you in the follow-up for the DWeb projects. I know that some of the most recent sessions may have been really generative for sparking potential projects. And we're really excited to see what you all come up with. So please take the time and submit the feedback and submit a project form if you haven't already to be considered for a late entry. And as always, we are happy to continue to collectively steward a harassment-free and respectful community for everyone, not only to the staff, but to all of the artists and students. Please take the time to update your pronouns. There'll be some discussion today, and continue to be kind and supportive to one another. It's been such a delight to support you all, and we are going to continue to be here in support. So feel free to reach out if you need anything, and looking forward to continuing to weave with you all. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to your amazing teachers for today, Regina, Harsanyi, and Sarah Grant, who are going to lead today's session on the evolution of DWeb, art, activism, and history. With that, I will hand it over, and thank you all so much for being a part of this inaugural DWeb for Creators course hosted by Gray Area and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. Thank you so much to them for supporting it, and excited for today. Hi, Regina. Hi, Sarah. Take it away.
Thanks as always, Roxy. All right. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can't believe this is the last session already. As you see, it was meant to be session 3, art history. So this is the first time we are exclusively focusing on art projects, which is exciting, and really talking about everything from the idea of telematic thinking through ordinals, right? And then everything in between. I'm sure you all have questions, but next slide. It's just the description there. Originally, we didn't have an icebreaker for this, but as this is a less interactive course in general, as more of a straight art history lecture, we wanted to add in to talk about what are some decentralized art projects that were interesting to you before this class, during this class, that you've discovered. If you'd like to share, we're going to go into that for about 10 minutes. We're going to talk about bulletin board systems, which have come up a little bit, early DWeb art before blockchain, and then go through a speed run through blockchain art history. And if we have time at the end, maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of your projects. Next slide. So with that said, with that icebreaker, I'd love to know more about projects that art projects that have really interested all of you. So if you want to raise your hand and link some projects and talk about why they've been inspiring to you in the chat, we will let you show and tell. I know you guys are probably all finding your links first before you raise your hand, so you could share what projects.
Juan posted something in the chat.
Oh, great. Juan, do you want to talk more about that?
Yes, I shared that one because I discovered some, maybe 2 years ago or so. And so Michel Foucault published, the French, say, university was keeping his classes private until someone like took them. And so this group of people published them through IPFS. And so, yeah, like they are illegally published, let's say, but then because they're on IPFS and they can be shared, even those like one node is taken away, then they can be still online. So I like this project.
I think Foucault would have approved of this project as well. So, okay. Let's see. Chris, you have your hand raised?
Yes, thank you. So I was thinking, I'm new to just being able to think of decentralized web as something for creators and art as well. So this is a brave new world. I'm excited to dive into all the things I can learn, all things that have already been done. So that's a fun place to be as an artist. But something I was think that drew me to this kind of approach to see how it's already been done and how I can maybe, remix on top of that was actually an OG case study, the Underground Railroad, and how Negro spirituals were used as like musical codes of wait in the water, God's gonna trouble the water, like literally wait there, the boat's coming. So how it was decentralized art by nature because it had to be, because there were all kinds of things going on to disrupt those channels of communication. And it had to be made durable and resilient in the structure of the art. So it incorporated motifs that were societally blanket okay to talk about for slaves, such as religion and God, and it hid in plain sight. So that kind of revolutionary, it didn't have to be violent. The art of it, rather, was actually just maverick, just genius and nonviolent and also empowering. So I like to revisit those case studies of, okay, how can we, I don't know, maybe instead of recreate the wheel, revisit what has been done well, and how can we bring that to the modern age? So decentralized art in that sense.
I love that example, Chris, this idea of oral history and oral memories as a form of decentralization. And Sarah and I were just talking a day ago about sneaker nets, and it's reminiscent of that, these kind of like offline ways of making sure we can connect with others across nodes. And then Claire, you have your hand raised as well. We're going to talk about Thing today, but I'd love to hear your perspective on Thing. Were you a member of Thing?
Yes. I was a member of the Thing and actually did grant writing for Wolfgang, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful time. Rhizome and the Thing had just come out. Mediamatic in the Netherlands was just starting to publish, and everything at that particular time was political. It was an activist statement to do that. It was, you had to log on to a BBS, and there was a community of philosophers and now famous people that were on that web, and it was a great time. And having this DWeb sort of circle back on that and continue that tradition is very exciting.
Thank you, Claire. And when I go over Thing, if there's anything else you want to add on the slide, feel free to chime in because I was not there, just a lowly historian.
And Rhizome too. I also wrote grants for Rhizome. They were both very exciting.
Mark, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, apologies for being a little bit late, but this is a writer, French philosopher, died a year or two ago, named Bernard Stiegler. Definitely active in kind of the democratization of knowledge in his courses and in his towns. I put a little essay that kind of talks about factories, server farms, and even psychotropic drugs possess the capacity to poison or cure our world. So he raises the notion of pharmacon, which is medicine, scapegoat, all panaceas are poison. And he talks a lot. He's one of the more interesting contemporary, unfortunately passed away, philosophers about technology. And he certainly has been active in trying to get his students to work with different formats of the internet. Some of them decentralized, some of them not. That's it. Thanks.
I love how a lot of these examples are not like visual fine arts in the way that we would, I guess that I expected, which means there's not a lot of overlap with what we'll be talking about today, which is good. So giving room to share that. Dawn, did you want to talk about non-humans a little bit? Because I didn't include that, but it looks like if not, you wrote some text about it in chat. Non-human art generators that get paid for their work on Bitcoin. really like sharing in that mixed authorship of machine and human, right? Should they be compensated? I love that. Oh, Mariette, you say Ramosi, the street artist. How does that relate to distributed and decentralized practices, art practices?
For me, Ramosi is just such an excellent, first off, just an excellent artist, and then also just one of the finer examples of Gothic futurism and futurism as a liberatory practice. And so in street art in general, the streets are an interweb of thoroughfares. And then in addition, you've got, which have been activated since time immemorial, I should note. And then in addition, really looked at how language and other structural elements of culture, metastructures, create belonging or interfere with belonging and empowerment. So I just feel like he's a great example, perhaps a fan. There we go.
Awesome. So we are going to go to the next slide, but if anybody here today has more artists that are working in decentralized web, and it could also just be in blockchain NFTs, that's okay. We're going to be talking about that today.
Yeah.
Just keep linking them for everybody. Yeah.
Regina, actually, before we move on, do we have time for one more? Just one more real fast?
Maybe a minute.
Okay.
Yeah,
'Cause I
we're going to
wanna
be
hear-
over.
Okay, because I want to hear what Sadaf said about She Who Sees the Unknown. That got skipped. Yeah. Sadaf, could you mention it? Yeah.
Oh, no worries. I just wanted to, when Juan was talking about Free Foucault, it reminded me of the archive Mauritian has. And I think the interesting thing about it is that it's pen access, but it has some codes to get into, which is a very interesting way of organizing decentralized archives, I think. So I just wanted to mention it. Thank you.
No, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I personally worked with Mauritian on blockchain related work. And then we have the work in an exhibition at the museum right now that does emphasize this idea of accessible knowledge. And Mauritian herself has asked the question of who should have access to this knowledge. So thank you so much. Okay. Next slide. So let's get started on where the question I always ask as an art historian is, somebody did something notable, who did that before them and before them? So we're going to start in 1978 here with Roy Ascott, who I just learned is still living. Now I want to be his best friend, but he's renowned for developing the concept of telematic thinking. And he comes up with this concept in the 60s and 70s. The concept centered around the use of computer networks and telecommunications technologies. And as Ascott would say, it was this idea of extending human consciousness and facilitating creative interactive exchanges across vast distances, right? He really was like an optimist of telecommunication technologies, right? Telematic thinking embraced the notion that digital networks could enable a radical new form of distributed authorship. He used that terminology, and it was really into this idea of participatory culture, which was also popular in the 70s. In general, performance was really like the art movement at the time, and users all over the world contributed to and altered content within shared virtual spaces that he would create. So he was also creating art projects that we'll get into. And the idea, though, was that it was important that it was something that could transcend geographical boundaries. So now today, it seems obvious. Right now, we're connecting over the web the way we are, but back then it was still radical and new. That envisions art projects that utilized computer-mediated telecommunications specifically. And we'll talk about a specific, I'll give one more quote that he said. He said, when art is a form of behavior, software predominates over hardware in the creative sphere. Process replaces product in importance, just as systems supersede structures. And I love this quote because as a time-based media conservator and art historians of media art, that quote gives me chills coming from the 70s, because it actually predates thinking, methodological thinking around time-based media art in general, to be considering these behaviors and considering software and considering process, right? I find myself still arguing with other art historians around the importance of process over the quote unquote finished work. So I'll just leave that with you all as artists yourselves to think about those differences in terms of focus. But I'm with Roy Ascott. Both telematic thinking and decentralized web advocate for communications infrastructures and over free-form centralized control, which he spoke about a lot without even thinking about directly what we've been talking about in other classes. He's an alien. But the idea was promoting collective creation, interaction, and this idea of democratization of cultural exchange. And that will be a common theme with a lot of these early projects. So I really see him as foreshadowing where we are now. And the most known project of his that's related to this class is Pleasure de Texte, which was in 1980. I would say it's his key work. And it connected participants from locations all around the world, as this was a focus for him, who collectively contributed texts and ASCII-based images to compose what Ascott termed a planetary fairy tale. Okay. But it's about to make more sense. And also, yeah, he's talking about this. It also will come up again in another project that he worked on as well. I wonder if Juan from IPFS was somehow inspired by the language that Roy Ascott uses around planetary, but he used an IP-sharp computer mailbox system to connect contributors over a period of 3 weeks to create this project. And each group or city was assigned an archetypal fairy tale character. So he's not just like in the clouds saying fairy tale, like they were given this like fairy tale character, and contributed to a narrative by passing it along to other groups via this computer networking system. As I mentioned, like he's interested in this concept of distributed authorship. And the title of La Pleasure de Texte is riff on the Roland Barthes text called The Pleasure of the Text, which emphasized the joy and fulfillment found in the collective of interactive creative processes. So again, Barthes wasn't thinking about decentralized web, but was thinking about the collective, right? And collective experience. Yeah, without saying, I think this is the godfather, the grandfather of really like all decentralized web art projects. Next slide. But going back a little further in time, mail art was and remains a genre of art that was in part meant to subvert traditional gallery systems and institutions through considering global postage services to facilitate this idea of open exchange. Usually the artworks were smaller scale and less expensive, but it was about creating this kind of decentralized network of participants through the system. And it is this kind of at least national, if not international, program that allowed for participation, sharing works directly, and community building across borders, which is a term that had been used by Edward Plunkett, who started the New York Correspondence School. And the New York Correspondence School was basically the core of the mail art movement. Some of you may have heard of the artist Ray Johnson. Ray Johnson's probably the most prolific artist that started this mail art movement, but Rauschenberg and Warhol were also part of this. Ruth Asawa, etc., were all part of this school and participating in this idea. And then looking back even further, my background was initially actually not in anything related to media arts, funny enough. I was really focused on international, interwar period experimental animation, and part of that definitely overlaps with Dada. So I'm thinking in terms of Dada and its relationship to proto-decentralization. And they had a movement, I think it was Man Ray, that tried to begin, or Interest in Zara, to create this book that Dada was really one of the first global movements in the art world in general. Before that, the United States was disconnected from Europe. Pre-United States, Europe was even disconnected. I'm going in a direction where I'm going to talk about Baroque or something and how that was across multiple European countries. But in general, there's more isolation in art movements up until the 20th century. So this is really the first time that there's this idea of globally unifying a movement and creating community. The Dada Globe book that they intended to create was never published, although there was an exhibition at MoMA a few years ago, I want to say in 2017, where they attempted to create some version of that to realize the idea. Next slide. Also, let me check the chat to see if...
Yeah, I'm also keeping an eye on chat as you go.
Oh, so the name of the project was called La Pleasure du Texte. He also used these themes in another project we're going to talk about in a little bit as well, because Roy did a lot of amazing work that kind of is thinking on this distributed web pre-distributed web kind of thinking. I also wanted to include an example that involves satellites. In 1977, Harsanyi and Zubair utilized satellite transmissions to establish a two-way communication link between artists, particularly located in New York and San Francisco. And they wanted to challenge the traditional one-way centralized flow of information that felt like all you had through broadcast media. You turn on your TV, you watch the news, you have no control over communicating over that. Sarah, maybe you have some thoughts about accessing the wavelengths, the frequencies to trip that. There's a history of that as well. But generally, this was a bold project that was directly using CTS Hermes satellites that operated a frequency of 12 to 14 gigahertz and were equipped, they were only like 200 watts, so they were really efficient to be used directly by these artists, and they could still like access each other in this kind of low powered, like inexpensive way. And then the videos were created using Sony Porta Packs, which were still relatively new at the time. I think it was like 1968 when they came out, so we're in 77. So that's all it was. It was like access to these satellites and Sony Porta Packs, and they were able to communicate with each other between these two cities across the nation. So there's a peer-to-peer element to this, of course. There is this democratized element, this use of telecommunication systems. There was some language around this that was very like anti-military as well, not just like media. It was in opposition to government and media centralization at the time. And yeah, unmediated peer-to-peer exchange and there's other projects. I'm sure some of you might be like, oh, what about this project and this project? I selected a few for our short 2.5 hours. Yes, I knew someone was going to mention the Kate Galloway, Sherry Rabinowitz project, but I didn't mention Hole in Space. I wanted to give another example that was a little less talked about, especially because I feel like Harsanyi does not get his flowers. Okay, so next slide.
One thing I wanted to add this real
Oh,
fast.
yeah.
Indeed, I do have something to say about satellite.
About
It's
accessing.
actually, yeah, this happens to be directly in my domain of interest. No, the thing that's interesting is there's been a fairly recently resurgent interest in satellites because there's like tens of thousands of objects that are satellites basically that are circling Earth. And yeah, this is all like infrastructure that's just up there. And the thing about this project that's significant among many reasons too is indeed like probes this space that's taken for granted by the military governments or like corporations that have huge amounts of money like SpaceX. So I think it's like one of these unexplored zones by artists, one reason being it's extremely inaccessible actually. And I know we don't have time to go into all this right now, but I just wanted to let you know that there is this artist, this Dutch artist, Matthias Hurdle, who I'll put his information in the chat, where he basically goes satellite hunting, which in itself is not a new practice, but he does that and he does tours and workshops too. I'll put his website because he presented at Radical Networks one year, really interesting work. And there are satellite pirates out there in the world that basically squat decommissioned old satellite connections that are not that difficult to reverse engineer basically and use it as a kind of peer-to-peer network of communications. And they're playing music, they're hanging out, getting drunk, doing all the things you're not allowed to really do normally on the airwaves. Anyway, just wanted to mention that.
No, it's so important. Yeah, check out, are there HTC Hermes like satellites still out there that you can co-opt? This is one of the reasons it would have been nice to do this in the third week, because maybe it would give one of you enough time to do a satellite project.
Yeah, and our studio is currently investigating satellites for an ongoing project, so I can't say much more than that for now, but it's a thing still. Okay.
Yeah, and not legal advice. We're just next slide. Okay, Roy Ascott did so many amazing things, as I mentioned, so I had to include at least one other example, but I think I get so frustrated with what has been happening since 2021 around this idea of, oh, media art and digital arts is brand new. I don't think any of us believe that, but Roy Ascott was actually asked to be part of the 1986 Venice with his projects. Like, the art world recognized the kind of like telematic distributed methodologies that artists were thinking about even in 1986. As I mentioned, this next project was called Planetary Network, not to be confused with IPFS. And it was an initiative that utilized the early Artex computer network, which used to be called Artbox, to forge a global community of artists engaged in a collaborative telepresent art experience across borders, just similar to Plaisir du Texte. And Artbox itself was an international computer mailbox system, also initiated by an artist, Robert Adrian X. And Artex, which came after that, was Artist Electronic Exchange System, and it evolved. And thanks to Bob Bernanke, is the person who's most related to Artex. He was a computer programmer that had interest in the arts. We need more of those. And it operated on the IP Sharp Associate system, which was similar to Plaisir du Texte. And it offered for the Venice Biennial for this project a worldwide network of computer services and businesses via telephone, which is similar to some of the projects we were talking about in the first class. So how it worked was during the Biennale's first 2 weeks, artists from 24 locations worldwide participated in a daily program of creative exchanges, sharing artworks, texts, and dialogues through network communication channels, which also included fax and slow scan TVs and emails and online conferences. Again, 1986, this still blows my mind. This facilitated a rich tapestry of cross-cultural dialogue and creative intersections in real time. And it was really, in 1986, the idea of trying to democratize an art practice or distribute an art practice is so foreign. Then the IP Sharp computer, just to explain a little bit more about that and how that worked, it's a time sharing network provided, and you could get free user accounts to join in and be involved in discussions during the biennial's run. And yeah, so right in the face of the biennial, where we were like undermining the art world on this grand scale. So I wish we had more documentation of it, but at the bottom you can see all of the locations where people were accessing the network. Next slide.
Okay.
So we've talked about bulletin board systems a little bit, likely in other classes, and bulletin board systems, of course, weren't just for the arts, and the only one we're really talking about today that it was just for art is The Thing, which Claire mentioned, but had an Artcom electronic network called ASIN, and Community Memories, the first BBS system ever that started out of Berkeley College, and they right away, people were trying to share like drawings and artwork and poetry over these systems, wanting to share art and as a form of communication as just the human experience. So yeah, Community Memory is the first computerized bulletin board system, and the Well, which was launched in 1985, is still operating. I don't participate in it, but I don't know if anybody here does. Sarah, are you like involved with the Well still? Okay, but it's referred to as more of a virtual community, but it is a BBS and that had ASIN to share artwork. And then The Thing, on the other hand, was founded by Wolfgang Stahl, and that started in 1991. And its focus was contemporary art and cultural theory, and that was before the transition to the early web. The project I include here in the upper right corner is one that I think about a lot, specifically in relationship to The Thing, which was Peter Haley's Super Dream Mutation, which really like predates a lot of the conversations we now have around NFTs, where it was used to raise funds in 1993 for The Thing, which had servers all over the world. It had multiple servers in Germany. It had servers in New York and South America. So that's one of the things that made it distributed. But it's still to this day, at the time that he was selling them for $25, it was not successful. I think only 2 people bought it, but you can still download it. And it's this idea that you can print it on whatever paper you want, or you can duplicate it as many times as you want. You could manipulate it. So I love that. Yeah, that philosophy is held true through digital art communities and through a lot of the conversations around blockchain. Claire, do you want to say anything else about Thing? Also, I know people who still use their thing.net email addresses, which is amazing.
That's cool.
Toastmasters Gallery still uses their .thing.
They do. That's exactly who I was thinking of. Yeah. Postmasters Gallery uses their thing.net domains.
They
So
still have a Wolfgang Steely light box in their window. It's Magda's favorite artwork. And it says, "There's no art in this town."
yeah, actually, if you go to the next slide, there's a quote from Wolfgang about how he was thinking about Thing. I'm not sure why I'm on a delay, though. I still don't see it.
Oh, it's there. Fair.
It says what mattered to Boys, because using that Joseph Boys idea of social sculpture and artistic production, and the idea work being jointly made by a community. So there's a running theme here, right? It's not just this idea of telematic presence, which is of course like an ongoing theme with this, but is this idea of collaboration and community.
They were very based on philosophy, and there were a lot of really heavy arguments. I don't know whether they had the code to not insult each other. I think they probably invented blaming people.
Also so human, right? On any blog or forum, or I actually like joined NetTime recently, which is it's a listserv for media artists that anybody can join. That's like well known from the 90s, especially. And yeah, people definitely will fight on those listservs.
For art, though. It was for art.
Mark, you raise your hand.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I found something called The Palace. And it
Oh,
was
yeah.
definitely one of the first distributed BBSs because you could
Yes.
download a server and everybody could share in serving the chats. And artists used it to say, it's like a avatar kind of space. And
Yes.
artists came in and they say, put on Waiting for Godot as avatars. And then a avatar called Godot showed up. That's wacky, but it's something I didn't know about until a couple weeks ago. And it is definitely quite a early decentralized group that's still going.
Yes, when you said it, I was like, oh my God, I could have definitely included that in this. I totally forgot about this. But yeah, if anyone wants to throw a link to that in the chat.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mark linked to the wiki. I also added a link to the Echo NYC run by Stacy Horn. It's another one.
Yeah, we
And
did
I
talk about it in
actually-
the first class. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, cool. And I linked an article there just from last year, actually, talking about the Echo. Anyway,
Yeah, again, there's too many things, too many,
yes.
which is great that there's examples out there. Okay. So to give an institutional example, I included the Agora Exchange project. This was a project that embodied participatory community. Again, I sound like a broken record, driven telematic presence with the Tate. And that was created by Natalie Bookchin and Jacqueline Stevens. Natalie's, I think, pretty big on NetTime. I still see activity there. It was an online platform that started in 2004. It was active all the way up until 2020, although I look at it as a project that never really succeeded. However, it was conceived technically as a virtual space, all about this idea of collective design and in political collective design, but it was advertised as an online game. But what the online game was, users were invited to imagine and construct an alternative model for society through the game's cooperative development process, and participants openly proposed and debated ideas related to reconfiguring societal structures like citizenship and wealth distribution, kinship relationships, land ownership, etc. They would call it, they're talking this kind of gamification, but it reminds me so much of decentralized autonomous organization voting structures without that literal structure. The bottom-up dialogic approach to rewriting the rules and dynamics of human organization aligned directly with core values, fostering more, it's a lot of language they use, more egalitarian, democratized digital spaces, in theory, outside of centralized control, although there's some irony there, I think. And yeah, so focus on it being like beyond geographically broad, same kind of themes, but it is commendable that the Tate was doing this in 2004. Next slide. And then Backspace, I was going back and forth if I was gonna keep this in here, but this is another London-based project that was started in the early 1990s by James Stevens, and it was a media lab ultimately that existed on and offline. That was also just like Roy Ascott, except years later, very interested in how computers could fundamentally decentralize how art itself was created and how we could change like collaboration over over distances. The platform empowered artists to circumvent. It had rhetoric around circumventing institutions, the opposite of the Tate, including rhetoric against galleries and media groups, connecting directly with global audiences through network digital channels. And for those of you who were around in the 90s for this was just common rhetoric during this period in general around net-based art, not just in relationship to distributed and decentralized web, where artists really saw the internet as this utopian way to not have to engage with galleries and museums at all. So Backspace really became like a safe space or a hub for that kind of dialogue and to foster those kind of collaborations and communities. And I think there's still a version of it that exists in some form called SPC Space now. Cyber Powwow is also, yes, that is actually how I probably learned about the Palace. Tao wrote in the chat about Cyber Powwow, yeah, which was also involved with Second Life at some point. Yeah, thank you for that. So let's move on to the next slide. Everything we've talked about up until this point was more so proto-decentralized web, while the projects we're talking about from this point forward are actually consciously engaging with distributed decentralized web technologies and ideas as we think about them now. So the first one I wanted to bring up was Tsunami.net. It was a Singapore-based artist collective that was active from 2001 to 2000. And they had a seminal project was Alpha 3.4, and it was an examination of the physicality and bodily-wise and infrastructural politics of the internet. The collective approach was that artists embarked on a journey, running, like a physical journey on the site of Documenta. So that's how they came to be known. This was for Documenta 11. And as they were running, there was a server that they had located in Castle and a website tied to that where they would install webcams across the way to broadcast on a live feed server, so that it's really playing with this idea of virtual performance in a sense, but also environment and body. And it was anchored by a browser called the WebWalker 2.2 browser. And they were able to transmit data like GPS coordinates via mobile phones at the time that would go directly to the browser, and that the mobile phone would have IP address access that correlated to the geographical position at any given moment. And yeah, it's like this, yeah, it's a relationship to cyberspace, actual space, phones, IP addresses, body. And again, I see more and more artists doing this now, but not back then. It's pretty nascent at the time. And then, sorry, I just lost my spot in my notes.
I can talk about the Paris. Oh, you want to talk about Scott Draves?
Yeah. So Scott Draves, actually, we wanted to have as an advisor for this curriculum because he was doing work that involved decentralized thinking and BitTorrenting and these systems to this day. At some point, more recently, he was even involved with stability, like Stable Diffusion. But Electric Sheep is a collaborative abstract artwork that used a distributed computing model to generate these works that he'd refer to as sheep. They were like these morphing abstract animations. You would download the software, and then you'd be plugged in to everybody else who is involved with participating in the Electric Sheep project. And people could vote on which projects would stay on the website after that. So it was like what Scott called this like genetic algorithm. And it's usually the first project I actually think of when I think about the decentralized, like proto-decentralized, pro-blockchain decentralized projects. If somebody would like to put a link so you can see what those works look like, I didn't put it in the slide, but it's a good idea to have an idea of what these sheep look like. The project, I believe, is still running to this day, so I think you can still participate and download the software. And then the Pirate Cinema was started by disinnovation.org, which is a group and an ongoing group, has an installation that was directly using BitTorrent, where often the way that they're installed are like these large multi-channel projections where you can see exactly in real time the works being downloaded off of BitTorrent, like clips from those videos. So if someone was downloading like Taxi Driver off BitTorrent, it would show up on the projection or downloading a Britney Spears music video or a song. It comes up in real time in the work. And there's been multiple iterations of this piece. I don't know if you wanted to say
say
more on
something?
that about
Yeah.
surveillance or something else related to the project.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, decentralization. Actually, I just showed this project to my students in Vienna, where I also teach, because a student asked me, I'm also explaining that course, peer-to-peer protocols, networks, and one of my students was trying to understand. I was trying to explain to them how this worked, and they're like, okay, but they're having trouble visualizing it. And I wanted to say that the Pirate Cinema, which then made me think, let me show you this project, because the Pirate Cinema does an absolutely amazing audiovisual job of showing you exactly how this protocol works. And yeah, the Pirate Cinema it basically makes visible, it reveals, makes audible and visible how peer-to-peer file sharing happens in real time. And they've shown it, like Regina said, I don't know if you said this, but I think you said it. There are normally these large installation screens, and it's just like this stream of clips from different files as like bits are grabbed from the network and then thrown up on the screen. And it's funny because the way that the project's designed is that so that you can filter for what kind of streams are put up there. And I don't know. Actually, they showed this project at Radical Networks, so I presume that they put some kind of filtering in place there. Because the thing is, the unfiltered BitTorrent network, you're just getting nonstop clips of porn, which shouldn't surprise anyone. But the link that I put in the chat, there's some videos that show the piece at work. So I really suggest you go and check those out, because you might understand a bit more intuitively how this stuff works, or how this protocol works.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide.
So
these are, yes, we're going to soon get to Sarah's own projects as well.
Yeah, which this one's not one of, but now I'm going to be sharing some projects that I became aware of during the time that I ran Radical Networks, which was at the time when I ran that event. I did it because I just wanted to make an event that I wanted to go to, which worked, it happened. But it turns out I also got to know so many amazing artists and projects along the way. And one of them that was also shown there was UmbrellaNet. So UmbrellaNet is this really wonderful project, I think, that was first presented in 2004. And then they were doing another version of it in 2016 when it was at Radical Networks. But anyway, basically the concept of this is, okay, so when you have an ad hoc network, ad hoc being another word for mesh network, and which also means it's a decentralized network, it's a dynamic network. People, nodes, computers, whatever, can come and go as they please. If you think of it like a swarm of insects, it can grow and shrink the group. People can come, or insects or whatever, can come and go as they want. That's how an ad hoc or mesh network works as well. And so the idea was, okay, can we explore something, like, can we explore a moment that unites everybody, that unites would-be members of this network, but in a way where maybe they're not like aware of each other, they're still going about their independent lives, yet are united by this shared human experience. So UmbrellaNet was that project. They made these special umbrellas that were outfitted with radios and lights and such. And basically, when it would start raining, if you had one of these umbrellas, you would open it up. And as soon as you open it up, your umbrella would start looking for other open umbrellas with the same gear on it and would associate with each other. And you'd become part of this ad hoc network. Anyway, yeah, it's again just exploring this idea of what connects us in a public setting without us having to be overly conscious of each other, which could be exhausting or annoying or whatever. It depends on where you're at in that moment in time. But just how are we connected in these shared experiences? Yeah, love that project for that. And there's a different, like, basically when the umbrella is not connected, it's glowing red. And then when it's connected, it's glowing blue. Another project, Netlist by Danya Vasiliev, also my partner and studio mate, and Vaisa Zevin. So this project, he actually made long before I met him, but I love this project. So Netlist is a networkless network. So what does that mean? So he basically was thinking of almost like parasitic ways to piggyback on specifically on public transportation. I'm trying to think about how I'm like framing it. Okay, so when we have our peer-to-peer networks or our mesh networks, usually we are the ones carrying the devices to wherever it is. We expect to associate with other devices. That's also a kind of sneaker net. Sneaker net is called so because of people having sneakers on their feet or whatever, physically walking data from one place to another for exchange. This is a sort of automated sneaker net. So you can see in the smaller square image, these devices that it's just a prototype, but the idea was that he would take a device, probably more conspicuous looking than this, and attach it to a public transportation, like a bus or a train. The pentagram diagram in the other image is a drawing of a prototype that he made of tracks that these devices were like running on. And whenever the devices would pass each other, at that moment, there would be an exchange of data, an automatic exchange of data. So it was just like you're walking by somebody without stopping and there's a data transfer and you just keep going. Anyway, yeah, it's so in this way, it's a networkless network in that it's like a by chance passing each other, ships passing in the night, exchanging some data. Maybe they don't even know they're exchanging the data, but it's happening and then going on their route. Something about it that I really like that idea. And I'll also add links to that in our chat when I'm done chatting, because the next one I wanted to talk about, actually, I think by now I think everyone's heard about this project of mine in this program, but just to mention it again, since it's relevant here, Futura Tropica. So it's a decentralized peer-to-peer network of Raspberry Pis that are running IPFS, which we learned about, or we've heard about by now a few times, and that are distributed all around the tropics. And it's thought of as being a network for the intertropical sharing of. So the concept of this project was coming from my collaborator, Juan Pablo Garcia Sosa, originally from Bogota, Colombia. And from his perspective, internet web technology was something that felt like it was being brought in from the north to the south in this top-down like airdrop. And he wanted to create this network that was a lateral, intertropical, intercultural exchange. So Futura Tropica was born out of that idea, and I worked with him to build the infrastructure. Meanwhile, I'll add some links in our chat for the projects I just talked about. So what, are we breaking for what, like 5 minutes or?
Let's break for 10 minutes, yeah.
10 minutes?
Before we get into the whole blockchain art history talk, I also just wanted to quickly correct myself and say that the tsunami.net project wasn't them running, it was them walking. And that the Documenta version was specifically them walking from Documenta to the server farm that was hosting the website where you could access their GPS information through their IP address. So just to clarify. Okay, so there's going to be a little bit of history hopping, but I always want to start when we talk about blockchain art history with 2011 with puny codes. If anybody ever tells you that X is the first NFT, no matter how often you hear it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, puny codes is the first proto visual object, like art object, beyond just like transactional textual data that was committed to a blockchain, period. And it was committed specifically to Namecoin, which is the first hard fork of the Bitcoin blockchain. And it was created so that you could put arbitrary data in a URI that connected to a domain name, essentially. So at any time that you would be using Namecoin, especially for something like visual information, if you were engaging with it for artwork, you're connecting it to a domain name of some kind. Punycodes also is special in that, just like what we'll talk about with CryptoKitties and the ERC 721 protocol, Punycodes exist as a proof of concept for the Namecoin chain altogether. It exists just to say this is what it could be used for. So for Punycodes, it uses a special encoding that converts Unicode characters to ASCII. And it was to allow for some level of artistic expression. However, you'll see that as it's ASCII, these Punycodes are very simple. But the first Punycodes committed were May of 2011. Okay, so I think we can just go to the next slide unless anybody has questions. And then on the Bitcoin blockchain directly, one of the first examples of visual work that was committed was Bitlen. So in 2011, also this was a few months later, just a few months later, Dan Kaminsky, who was a securities researcher and interested in DeFi and involved with Bitcoin, along with Travis Godspeed, paid tribute to Len Sassaman. That's who you see here. That's BitLen. He was also a computer securities researcher that was really influential to those involved with Bitcoin, and he had passed away. Len Sassaman. So Dan Kaminsky embedded this ASCII art portrait and text in the Bitcoin blockchain. And this was achieved by utilizing a transaction, or actually it was multiple transactions, to store what we refer to as arbitrary data. I mentioned in the title that this is before op return. Op return, as we've mentioned in other classes, blockchains are constantly going through soft forks. There's constantly updates. Just because you have consensus doesn't equal immutability the way you think. So op return allowed for, it was easier to put arbitrary data into a Bitcoin transaction once it happens, but this is before that. So the way that you would really have to be like going out of your way to place arbitrary data in these transactions. So the way that you see it as a single ASCII work here, but he had to put in little bits of it over multiple transactions, and then you can compile it together to get the image you see here. And so yeah, this is 1 and 2. Really, you have Punicodes, and then you have Len and people who are going rogue and putting some ASCII data into Bitcoin. Next. And then the first group, the first company that was ever really thinking about should art have some relationship to blockchain was Kedom, which later became better known as Ascribe. I think those who know about it only probably know it as Ascribe. It was the earliest platform that leveraged blockchain technology to secure, in their opinion, secure digital art and intellectual property. This was around 2013. Ethereum didn't even exist yet. It didn't even exist as a testnet yet. So it was fully for Bitcoin. And the artists that they'd reach out to, which included Harm Vandendorpel, Constant Dullart, and this is a screenshot of a work from Jonathan Monahan. Lorna Mills is part of this as well. There's a lot of artists who were in 2013 already having conversation about blockchain because of Ascribe. So Ascribe doesn't exist anymore, but I think a lot of the founding members now work on something called the Ocean Protocol, which is different. But going back a little bit, the story of Ascribe is really sad. Not only is it sadly, often I almost never see it get recognized as this important period of blockchain art history. It's been forgotten in many respects, but the reason why it's been forgotten to some degree is because they would host the artworks on a centralized server. I think they were using Google, and it became too expensive when they saw that this concept was way too early and essentially failed, and they just deleted the server. All of the works that were associated directly with these Bitcoin transactions no longer exist via the Ascribe server. Of course, the artworks still exist, but to trace those transactions, those histories, has become all but impossible, except for one, at least one so far. If anybody's interested in doing research on this, we'd love to find more. But the Jonathan Monahan piece, Mothership, we do know exactly what the Bitcoin hash is that was registered to this work, but it's all word salad type metadata. You only know because of the documentation. Nothing like on chain is going to actually help you understand that information. Nevertheless, this is still super important because nobody was executing, maybe they were thinking about it if they weren't executing on this idea yet before Ascribe. Next slide. Except, I don't know, I think Kalani isn't joining us today, but I'm about to shout out Kalani quite a bit. So in 2013, Kalani Nicole, who was the founder of Transfer Gallery, was already working with artists who were interested in selling their work with Bitcoin and making commentaries around this. So Laturbo Avedon, who Kalani worked with quite a bit at the time, created a project called New Sculpt, and New Sculpt was in itself was a media artwork that had nothing to do with blockchain or distributed or decentralized networks. Laturbo would take images from friends and colleagues and manipulate them into these images and then also host them on Second Life at the time. But they were only available for purchase through Bitcoin. And Transfer Gallery was specifically using the Mt. Gox exchange at this time. We'll talk about that in a second. That basically, I guess I could talk about it now. Mt. Gox was hacked and drained of essentially all its funds. It no longer exists. It's like a example of what not to do. So a lot of the funds that Transfer even made through Bitcoin at the time or even client directly have been lost. And a lot of people have a similar story. Next slide. And then this was also shown through Transfer Gallery. Another artist that works with Transfer quite a bit or is Daniel Temkin. And this project was basically, it operated as an online auction house. This early on, this is also 2013, everyone. My mind's still blown about that. And what they did for this project was Daniel was offering a collection featuring both quote unquote legitimate net art while also having them all create counterfeit artworks of each other's, basically imitating each other's work. So if you look down here, I'm pretty sure like the work, I don't think that's a Claudia Mate. I think it's someone replicating Claudia Mate, and that's not a Francois Gamma. It's someone replicating Francois Gamma. But Ai Weiwei was also part of this, Bill Miller, Daniel Temkin, of course. And so the idea was to expose net art itself as a viable asset class, like make fun of that, but then also by creating their own art shadow market. There really wasn't an existing dialogue around this related to Bitcoin. So the idea of creating a net art shadow market or even secondary market at all was really like nascent concept. And they all come with like authentication documents as part of the conceptual silliness of it all. And you only know who faked the Francois Gamma after you purchase it. So there's just a lot of layers to thinking about. Also the anonymity conversation, again, as early as 2013. And yeah, also unfortunately was through Mt. Gox. I think the website is still up. If it's not in its current state, I think it's available via Wayback Machine, but I'm pretty sure there's no new projects coming out of it now, and certainly not with Bitcoin. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned Namecoin earlier, but I need to mention it again because as I was alluding to, you will constantly hear that the first artwork, the proto NFT, or people even call it the first NFT, even though non-fungible tokens as a concept couldn't exist yet, was Kevin McCoy's Quantum. So yes, I think it's still really important to include Quantum, which was a GIF and was connected through a DNS in this history. It is still one of the first works that was committed to a blockchain. And of course, it has the storied idea around the fact it was like at Rhizome 7-on-7 and all these things that like brought it to a wider art world's recognition, so that maybe didn't know about Ascribe and didn't know about things like puny codes. But ultimately, yeah, it's an off-chain GIF. But because of this history that has been forged around the work, this lie that it was like the first NFT, and I should say that I love Kevin and Jennifer McCoy, and they make amazing work, and I work with them all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about his platform in a moment, which I've also partnered on and worked with. But because of this story around the work, it's made over $1 million at a Sotheby's auction in 2000. I don't know if I have a slide for this. Can you go to the next slide? When I talk, yeah, so I guess there's no image for it, or the images didn't pop up because I pasted them in. But so Monograph is Kevin McCoy's NFT platform. Pre-NFT though, because it was started in 2014. It was originally for Bitcoin. So this is really the first platform after Ascribe that's interested in committing works to a blockchain. The idea was to authenticate and monetize digital art. So Monograph meant monetized graphics. That's where the term comes from, and evolved to also include Ethereum, and now unfortunately is defunct. Although in its last year, we've started connecting it to IPFS and creating these more archival packages and everything that we went through in our workshop. So it's sad. And then Left Gallery was co-founded by Harm van den Dorpel. And Harm, as I mentioned, was one of the inaugural artists to ever register any work to a blockchain with Ascribe. And he's based in Berlin. And it operated a lot more like a gallery where he'd bring in digital artists and friends and sell work again at the time with Bitcoin, and it did eventually also accept Ethereum. And I think it might have been the last project that Left Gallery ever did was a project with Kalani and I on Ethereum called, I can't remember what it's called right now, but I don't talk about it in this, so that's probably why. But you can still go to the Left.Gallery site and see what works have sold in the past there, and there's just a bunch of pop-ups telling you it's no longer in existence, and we still have a long way to go with archiving this important history. But yeah, so that's 3 platforms that kind of existed before NFTs. And then we talked about Namecoin as a fork of Bitcoin, but then another example of a Bitcoin derivative is Counterparty, and it had its own art projects on it right at the time. And this is more so, now we're around 2014. Okay, so we have a few of these projects in 2011. We have Kevin in 2014 with Quantum, and then where there's a lot happens once we hit 2014. So Counterparty was a platform that extended Bitcoin's functionality by allowing users to create and trade digital tokens, because as we've mentioned, Bitcoin is not something that's meant for decentralized applications. Like, it only exists to transact Bitcoin. So you have to build elements on top of that to really force it to do things like have Counterparty exists. And one of the art projects that was started on Counterparty was Nilly Coin, and this was by Nilly Lerner. And for Nilly, the tokens, it was all satire around tokens that were proportional in ownership to stocks of like corporate entities like iCoke and iDisney and iToyota and iEbay and iTwitter, iApple, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I feel like she also doesn't get her flowers enough around thinking about these concepts. But what everybody seems to know Counterparty for is Rare Pepes. And I believe that's a little later. I want to say it's 2016 that Rare Pepes come out. And Rare Pepes really represent everything that I personally don't like about decentralized finance and speculative treatment of collectibles and artwork. I think Rare Pepes really exemplify, unfortunately, what the average consumer thinks about the technology. And it's definitely not something I support, but it was a counterparty project that predates the Ethereum blockchain and predates NFTs. Next slide. I mentioned Ethereum testnet. So Ethereum testnet launches in 2014. Ethereum launches publicly in 2015. But there were artists who were already experimenting on testnet. At least Rhea Myers was. I don't know if there's any other artists that were experimenting with the testnet phase, but to give an example, Rhea Myers created a piece called Is Art, and while it was still on testnet, and how it works simply is that if you pay a transaction fee, a gas fee, you can switch it to this contract is not art, and then if you pay another transaction fee, it switches it back to this contract is art, back and forth. And if you pay for it, you can still do that to this day. And it's just a good example. Rhea is really interested in making work that makes not only direct commentary on blockchain and tokens and the culture around that, but what does it mean to actually treat a smart contract or a blockchain as a medium? Too often do people say that blockchain is a medium, period. I would say that's only the case in point something percent of works, 0.1% of works, and Rhea definitely falls in that category. And then Mitchell F. Chan created the project in 2017. We're still before NFTs here, but we're on actual Ethereum now. This is in 2017. Mitchell F. Chan created Digital Zones of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibility. Say that 10 times fast, which is a series of tokens that represents the empty digital spaces imbued with an immaterial artistic sensibility. And these, because we don't have NFTs yet, they were sold as ERC20 tokens using an earlier iteration of Ethereum blockchain. Well, that's a long story, but the idea is based on Yves Klein's Zone of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibility, which was already questioning the idea of artwork ownership and value, this idea that you buy this, you collect, what you ultimately collect is the certificate of the thing. The currency of the thing is the thing itself, which is burned. So this is what you have. You have just the receipt. Okay, so next slide. And then also in 2017, a book is published. Again, we're before NFTs here still, which was called Artists Rethinking the Blockchain. We've probably mentioned it in these classes before because this was in part through Furtherfield, Ruth Catlow, and Mark Garrett, the co-founders of Furtherfield, were part of this. And it's an anthology that they created that is all about like speculative, conceptual, technical engagements with blockchain at this time period. And they were doing exhibitions at the time. I talk a little bit more about Furtherfield in that. The publication also included some DAO language already, like Terra, Zero. I don't go into detail about it in this talk, but it already existed at this time, which is a project by Primavera De Filippi, who was a lawyer who is a lawyer and artist, and others. And Rhea Myers is also featured heavily. Hito Sterl is even featured in Artists Rethinking the Blockchain, but well before NFTs. So I encourage everybody to read this. I'm sure it's already on the reading list. I would not be shocked. Slide. And then also, some of you may know this already, but others may not, that CryptoPunks predates NFTs. Okay, it's before the ERC 721 protocol. It was started in 2017. I really personally continue to argue that CryptoPunks is incredibly important to art history, not just visual studies, because it really set off how we really think about what artworks committed to blockchains are. There's an entire movement that still has vestiges of it today around the idea of making 10,000 of something, right? This idea of a series of 10,000 works, generative works, right, coming from a singular code base that is particularly generated upon mint. That all started before NFTs with CryptoPunks, right, which was started by Larva Labs. I personally remember scrolling through the CryptoPunks website in like 2017-18 and going to myself, it's too difficult to download a digital wallet. It wasn't as straightforward at the time. And boy, do I still regret that to this day. But yeah, so aesthetically, also just being ahead of its time, it has influenced this entire generation, like hundreds, if not thousands of projects. So it's super essential. Last thing I'll say about this is, although initially was not on an NFT, an ERC 721 smart contract on Ethereum, it has since been migrated. So there's like a CryptoPunks, I think it's like CryptoPunks 2.0. The canonical CryptoPunks, as we understand them, have been migrated to an NFT smart contract now and have been transcoded into Solidity. So you will see them now as. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the birth of the NFT and the ERC 721 and how it was always related to artwork. So the ERC 721 protocol was introduced in January by what became to be known Dapper Labs. So Dapper Labs are also the creators of CryptoKitties. So what I have here is just a screenshot of the original Ethereum improvement proposal. That's what EIP means. And right in the abstract, they mention unique artwork. Interestingly, though, at the time, they weren't thinking about digital art at all. They were thinking about using NFTs to somehow tie that to tangible paintings or sculptures. But just the idea of being able to have this non-fungible token that's directly related to a unique object was the idea. And just as I mentioned, Codes was the proof of concept for Namecoin. CryptoKitties becomes a way to prove that ERC 721 NFTs are useful as a concept. So if you go to the next slide, and they say unique pictures of kittens here to preface that. So CryptoKitties was launched in 2018 alongside this EIP. In the ERC 721 smart contracts. And this was, as I was looking back at the research on this, I was surprised. I never referred to it as a game, but they referred to it as a game, essentially. So what you would do is you'd collect an image of a crypto kitty, and they had what they would call cattributes. I feel so silly saying these things out loud. And if you collected another CryptoKitty, there was a code base that would recognize that you had both those kitties in your wallet, and then you could spawn a third CryptoKitty that used the cattributes of the other two CryptoKitties to produce genetically like a cat that could only have come from, and generatively could only have come from those two cats. So this was a big deal, craze at the time in 2017. They were worth a lot more money now. And for some reason, which I can't answer in this moment, they are not valued very highly. CryptoPunks still are, but CryptoKitties being like the NFT in a sense, in my opinion, because it was the proof of concept, somehow holds very little value in current collectors' wallets. Next slide. Also, does anybody have questions? I just want to check. Cypherpunks. Oh, okay. I think that's referring also to the Solidity versus the.
So cypherpunks, when
Oh, yes. You're talking about the influence.
Yeah, the influence. So Whitfield
Yes.
Diffie and the PGP, when that came out in the 90s, there was a huge group of people basically really pushing for digital freedom, digital anarchy. Now, the CryptoPunks is a specific group, but the cypherpunks are also called CryptoPunks.
Yes, and that is not something that was lost at all on the Larva Labs group. That was a direct influence of theirs for sure. So I can't remember if this slide was something that I just didn't fill in or that I copied and pasted in things that didn't hold. But we could still talk about Ethereum, early Ethereum platforms. The first one that popped up that I'm aware of that is still to this day recognized was Super Rare, and that was in April 2018. Super Rare, of course, is still around and dedicated, at least they would think, to being a marketplace for artwork that's associated with ARCs registered to the blockchain. Another one that it was super early, that was like literally in the same room as like Kalani and I at these like weird salons in 2018 was Rarible. See, of course, also started in 2018. These really all just started happening right after the ERC 721 protocol. And another that at the time was something we were all discussing in the art world was snark.art. They exist in a more like private way, in a more private way. I don't know how public they are with their projects, but at the time they really stood out because they did maybe I mentioned this before in another class. I don't know how much we've actually talked about art examples, but snark.art did a project with Yves Sussman. That was one of the first examples of what does it look like to fractionalize a piece across different collectors and what does it mean for them to have to be in contact with each other in terms of shared ownership so that the work could be seen in its completion. So this was, and if you go to the next slide, actually, Sarah, I think I start talking about the conversations we were having. Despite a lot of the rhetoric that was happening in 2021 and after, the art world was there. We were there, guys. Like people who worked in museums and galleries and the art world, we were talking about NFTs. We were talking about blockchain in 2018. But the conversation was a little bit different. It was really focused on provenance at the time. We all thought that not just provenance in general, but like the idea of, oh, should people take their collection of works from the 17th and 18th century and register them to a blockchain and trace the provenance? Of course, none of that is a good idea. I hope you all understand why now. But we didn't know any better in 2018. And so people who were still claiming that provenance is useful, shame on them. And then fractionalization, like I said, the Yves Sussman project, thinking about it that way, I don't mean in like necessarily the financial form of fractionalizing, but like how do you actually split artworks across a group and what does it mean in terms of participation, etc. That was exciting at the time. Obviously discussing the digital art market in general, this feeling that we've tried over and over again for decades to sell works that were born digital and that they didn't have this market, this whole right-click save situation. And then finally this idea that, oh, if you could register a work to a blockchain, it would, be made unique and no one could duplicate it, etc. Of course, we found out that wasn't true. Has it emboldened the digital art market? Sure, we can't deny that. But the naivety and the optimism that we had in 2018 was very different than the conversation we're having now. And of course, preservation at the time, we've already talked in depth about why that is definitely a misnomer. But at the time, people believed that by committing a work to a blockchain, you are preserving born digital work and it's some magic solution, right? Next slide.
Before we move on, there was a question from Krishna on, can you summarize in your words why provenance doesn't work?
Hold on 1 second. For some reason, hopefully you guys can still hear me. I got locked on my computer for 5 seconds. So essentially, like the whole idea of provenance being kept in records, like in manila folders, has more of a chance of surviving 100 years from now than committing a work to a blockchain, because the whole idea that provenance is useful through the use of a blockchain just because you can create some kind of checksum or a hash breaks down once you recognize that the blockchain itself is software and is not immutable in the way we think there's no such thing. Permanence and blockchain are not real. There's no such thing of permanence for these blockchains. So why would it be a better solution to timestamp it and give it a hash on this system that won't be in the same state in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years? Like it's not this magic solution to preserving any kind of history, let alone provenance history. And on top of that, As we talked about the Bitcoin, Bitlen, and Monograph and Scribe, etc., and I've said probably in other classes, generally, if you try to look for a work that is associated with a blockchain, all of its useful metadata is centralized to the Web 2.0 platform. So if you actually go into a terminal window and try to pull any data that's directly actually like on chain or even using Etherscan, you'll find that none of that data is useful in you understanding what the artwork is, who's actually transacted. A string of numbers and letters isn't going to help you understand the provenance of who the owner of that wallet was. The anonymity aspect in general is just completely useless for appraisers. So that's just two huge reasons. But yeah, so basically like, anybody who tries to argue that provenance is useful, again, like shame on people who say preservation or provenance. This is why this curriculum exists, everyone. It's so I can tell you this so that who's ever saying that, they might have good intentions and they might just not know any better, but it's like nothing grinds my gears anyway.
Yeah, Josh is saying this is the opposite of what everyone says about blockchain. Totally, but that's also, but we wanted to make this course so that we can all think critically about and just really think with clear eyes what this, not anti any of this technology, but just to have an educated head on our shoulders about the true nature of things. And yeah.
Yeah, and again, that people, I think a lot of probably what we've talked about in the second half is different than what you've heard. Yeah, anyway. So more about Furtherfield. So Furtherfield, we already talked about a little bit with Art Rethinking the Blockchain, was also super ahead of their time. So we're going back in time a little bit. We've been talking about 2018, but here I think we're even going back to 2014, 15 as an entity, but they've been on the forefront of exploring the intersection of art and technology. I hate saying that, but I guess I wrote that in my notes, with a particular focus on decentralized networks since its inception, really. So they were founded in 1996. And they were already really working on projects that were interested in the concept of peer-to-peer and always looking for ways to distribute work and kind of these kind of proto examples we've given. But they also, because of that, adopted blockchain really early and created a bunch of publications around this work. And if that's not already in your materials, like I could add 10 different documents that are related to all the work that they were doing as early as 2015, 16, 17, 18. So even in 2015, they launched an Art Data Money program, as they called it, which aimed to develop a commons for the arts in the networked age. And this led to the creation of what they called DCAL, which was called Decentralized Art Lab. And that was a platform that mobilized crowdsourced research, and they still do this kind of work, and it was developed by artists using blockchain and web technologies that rethought Web 2.0. Just Agora Exchange, actually, a lot of what Furtherfield does now reminds me of that. It's this idea of trying to foster fair cultural ecologies and economies. And I haven't asked Ruth this, but I imagine that she was probably quite inspired by what the Tate was doing with that project. And so many exhibitions they've done. This is one example that just shows a really early iteration of Terra's installation. They've had some incredible exhibitions that are a lot more, I don't know how to explain it. Not that this isn't like a high quality installation, but this feels like really early days compared to the Terra Zero pieces I see now, which was started by Paul Seidler and others. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to DAOs. But they also, Ruth is behind Radical Friends and all these other projects. So maybe she should teach one of these semesters, actually. So then let's get to 2021 because we can't avoid it. So the NFT boom of 2021, it didn't start with Beeple. I'm using Beeple as the example here. Beeple found out about blockchain from Pac, who was like trying to him into this stuff.
I think it ended with people in some way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is the end, guys. I'm ending with some sad.
The sell sign.
We went from Roy Ascot to freaking Beeple, guys. Sorry, I gotta keep it together. But since I was there in the summer of 2020, I started hearing the like rumblings from artists again about blockchain technology. And I was like, really? Like people are still talking about this? And they were like, yes, please look at this platform. Like they're starting to like work with media artists, and the art market thing came up again. I was like, fine. So that's summer of 2020, you started hearing the beginnings of this reaching like a much wider audience. And then if some of you remember Clubhouse, yeah, it came and went. It was Clubhouse really around like December 2020, January 2021, where not only was the concept of blockchain reaching like a wider audience with all of these lies that we talked about, that's what got a lot of people into this stuff. But it also really reached the ears of celebrities, like a lot of celebrities for the first time. And suddenly, even before people, you start seeing like on the news and like on talk shows, like just people starting to talk about blockchain technology as this preservation tool, all these things that really, at the end of the day, were really just about speculative finance. Okay. And then Beeple happens, right? So Beeple sells this 500 everyday's kind of piece for $69 million. And I don't really have to tell you what happens after that. So we can go to the next slide. But everything changed. Everything changed from this moment. And suddenly it went from like a niche group of really nerdy people talking about this stuff and making interesting projects half the time to the whole world's asking your grandfather, asking you what an NFT is at Thanksgiving. And this also really led to a lot of motion graphics designers and people coming from the media industry that didn't really care about visual art world, fine art world at all, probably never stepped foot in a museum, suddenly making work that catered to their own and pandered to their own audiences. And there was a lot of like in buying happening and nasty stuff that made a lot of these people multimillionaires. But this is, I think, if we weren't thinking about pudgy penguins or CryptoPunks or something that was more collectibles, what we would maybe define as collectibles, it was a lot of this stuff. It was a lot of this motion graphics designers, high sheen crap. Next slide. And one of the artists on this page is called Fuck Renders. No one's safe in this lecture. If you're gonna call yourself that, then I'm gonna say that you're just in it for speculation. And then there were art-centric platforms that began to pop up. So you had the super rares and you have the rareables, and they often were started by developers who were in it for speculation, were in it to get their bag, never worked with an artist before, didn't understand what documentation would need to be provided, just told artists to upload a single file, a compressed file, and call that their art. That's what was happening for the most part early on. But then you have other platforms come about that arguably were a little bit more thoughtful, not perfect, but thoughtful. Art Blocks, for example, I'm also on their curatorial board myself, really I've referred to them as almost having this gallery model, like the way that I think the founders treat the artwork, although they involve speculation and this element of surprise in the way that they host and sell the work. There are multiple people working for them with master's degrees and PhDs in art history, and it shows in a lot of the quality of the work. And then Feral File was co-founded by Casey Reed, who is also the co-founder of Processing Programming Language, and is an incredible artist. And they're incredibly different than a lot of these platforms because they focus on curators. So another thing I didn't mention that you've probably heard rhetoric around already in general out there is that most of these platforms and the way a lot of these artworks were being registered and marketed didn't have a lot of curatorial context to them whatsoever. You would ask these collectors like, oh, what do you actually like about this work that you collected? They would just not even know what to say because there was zero context around the work. It was just for speculative finance purposes. And Feral File instead decided to center the curator and ask Christiane Paul, myself, and a lot of others. Barbara London was involved with some of these to actually write an essay around a group show and conceptualize each of the pieces and do things that were outside the paradigm of what you would think is something registered with an NFT. They're not perfect by any means, but there's something more thoughtful there. Tonic was started by somebody who's been an art consultant for years and actually worked at Gagosian and understands art valuation. Verse, same thing. One of the co-founders has a PhD in art history, I believe, and they are very much more like a gallery, I would say, than what we generally think about when we think about NFT marketplaces. Next slide. And then I just want to give a few examples of artist DAOs. There's many of them. There was definitely a craze, I would say, between 2021 and 2022, where if an artist was making a certain amount of money minting NFTs, they were probably going to create a DAO. But Jonas Lund's token, the GLT, as it's called, has a DAO around it where you can vote essentially on his career. You can vote on the next project he's going to create, and his entire practice, in theory, because I'm about to ruin this for you, in theory, is giving it over to his collectors. So it's, Jonas in theory would have to go to his collectors in this DAO and a Discord and be like, the Pompidou wants to show my work. Should I do it? And then there'd have to be a vote, right? Like with their tokens. Where I'm going to ruin it a little bit, but not really. I think Jonas's DAO is one of the most interesting and successful that I could use as an example. He owns most of his tokens, so he has majority vote. Yeah. And then Manny's game is another good example. Because of Manny's game, there's Manny DAO. Manny is the character you're seeing here. He's an actual person. He's also known as Manny 404. It's this video game environment, this like virtual world. Manny produced a project with his image where you could tattoo Manny's virtual figure and all these kind of fun elements. And that DAO also is a lot more active, I noticed, than others because there's such a playful element in using his own image in these works. And also there's this open source element to Manny's game and his projects where they're all hosted on GitHub. And token holders can add commits that improve Manny's projects. And ultimately, Manny is the only one who can actually deploy do the actual pull request, the pull for it. But they've done things like fix his eyelids and stuff like that. So next slide. And then there's Tezos. So Tezos, every project that we've talked about thus far since the Ria Meyers piece has been all on Ethereum. In 2021, a new blockchain protocol came about called Tezos, right? Or a blockchain rather. And we've talked about Tezos before, but not exactly in the context of art. Tezos, by 2021, really centered itself as a blockchain for artwork. And the reason why a lot of artists were attracted to Tezos, even though Ethereum was so popular, is because the cost to deploy a smart contract for an artist or to purchase an artwork, anything like that, was really expensive. Like in the height of 2021, it could have been like $1,200 to deploy a smart contract. So gas fees could have been like $800 just to interact with the blockchain, which is just not sustainable for a single artist. And Tezos, on the other hand, their gas fees were like pennies on the dollar. And they also, at the time, could argue that they were more environmentally friendly because they were proof of stake, right? Because at this time, in 2021, Ethereum was still proof of work. So any of these artists, especially media artists that were really interested in what was happening on blockchains, but were not okay with the environmental factors, like finally had a solution by using Tezos in their minds. So yeah, it's cheap, much, much cheaper. And this actually, we'll talk a little bit more about this probably on the Hiketnung slide, but it really attracted artists in the global south because they believed that cryptocurrency in theory could be useful to them. Of course, I think it was Ecuador that was already using Bitcoin around this time that was trying to be a proof of concept for that. Tezos, as many of you might know, has like basically no value, so that probably didn't really work out. However, because it attracted so many artists, they created their own market. Like artists became collectors more so than you saw in Ethereum. So artists were making work, they were collecting each other's work, they were creating communities. Prices of artwork were usually quite lower too. Of course, it still exists. But I showed this example here, it's a little bit cheeky maybe, that recently so Tezos had made enough money and had tried to center, at least in their marketing, artists as much as possible, to the extent that they started funding, being a major sponsor for Art Basel Miami Beach. And they did this in 2021 and 2022. But then this December in 2020, they no longer decided to sponsor at that level, but they still wanted to have a presence. And so they did this, which has been lovingly referred to as Tezpol. And this was a disaster. They received so much backlash about this that they are now turning themselves around and putting more serious funding into arts again. So thanks, Tezos. And the Platform Hicket Nunk, or HEN as it was referred to, was really the superstar marketplace of Tezos. It was started by Brazilian artists, and one of the reasons they shut down was because it went from being about focusing artists from the global south and giving artists opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have them, to feeling like that they were being overshadowed by your typical white male artist that already had a CV and gallery exhibitions, etc. And it lost the original intention of why it existed in the first place. So the founder, Rafael Lima, notoriously flipped out and deleted Hicket Nunk. Just deleted it one day and said that he would like never reinstate it and he was done. But why I show this image is because, not because of the blockchain, a little bit because of the blockchain. Hicket Nunk was able to be reinstated, so that because the entire UI UX was on GitHub and it was open source and was free. So you had 3 different groups try to reinstate different domains of Hicket Nunk for a couple, like at least a month, before finally they did this like community-wide Tezos vote to keep one of them, which ended up being one that was co-founded by a lot of the developers who had worked under Rafael, and now that's Taya. If you don't know that Taya came out of HEN, so that's Taya.art. A lot of people at the time were claiming like, oh, it's because of the blockchain that we were able to reinstate it. So no, it's because of GitHub that we were able to reinstate the website. Of course, because all the transactions were still on the Tezos blockchain though. Yes, like that's an element of it. Next slide. There's so many things I could continue to talk about the subject. I'm happy to answer questions if you feel like I didn't cover an artwork or an artist or a platform or something, but I did want to bring up ordinals because I felt like some of you might want me to talk about it. So ordinals is a Bitcoin related project. Without going to too much technical detail, just like I talked a little bit about OpReturn as being a soft fork on Bitcoin, like these constant updates that are in reality happening, there was this really controversial update that happened. There's 2 of them, but one of the main ones was called Taproot, and that allowed for individuals to include additional arbitrary data on fractions of Bitcoin. And fractions of Bitcoin, if you have like under 1 Bitcoin, so if you have 0.9, 0.01, etc. Bitcoin, they're called Satoshis. These soft forks didn't just allow you to commit arbitrary data to a Satoshi, but you could actually commit arbitrary data to Satoshis that have already been minted, and go back and like on a date and a hash that's already passed, add arbitrary data to it. And for whatever reason, from a marketing perspective, it's the same damn people that in 2020 are like trying to just get everybody to adopt this stuff as a Trojan horse so they become millionaires, are saying like, oh, this is like the one true way, permanent way to commit artwork to a blockchain is by adding it to this arbitrary data of Satoshis that have already been minted to Bitcoin. And so I use this image of what's called a Taproot wizard because it is one of the most popular projects that is involved with ordinals now. But what we also have is people are taking their projects that were on Ethereum and just re-minting them as like a duplicate on as ordinals. So again, I do have some artist friends who said that they want to experiment with ordinals, but generally we are in this height of 2021 state right now with this, and I don't know how long it will last, but this is like where we currently are in the broad scheme of things. Beyond the fact that there are amazing artists like Mitchell and Rhea and Harm Bandadorpal, who made Mutant Garden Seeders, which I don't talk about directly here, that are doing really interesting work that involves the blockchain behaviorally and not just in terms of marketplaces or finances. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, final questions. Yes, I'm looking at the comments a little bit. I see shots fired. Sorry, my voice is breaking up. If you want me to go over anything else, okay. And yeah, Christian, did what I explained help with that at all? It's basically exactly what I said. It's not doing anything else, really.
I guess my question is, what's the purpose of writing the data, random data? Are they just saying, oh, this is something different now that there's random data on it?
Oh, so when I say arbitrary data, I should qualify that. That's a good question. Arbitrary data means any data that isn't just the straightforward transactional data that is like mining coin and the hash that is associated with BTC currency. Because going back to what I said earlier, Bitcoin doesn't exist for decentralized applications. It didn't exist for anything to be built on top of it. It only exists to transact Bitcoin. That was its purpose from like a Satoshi Nakamoto perspective. So when I say arbitrary data, it means anything beyond that. The ability to commit an image, the ability to commit a video, the ability to commit a poem. That's all considered arbitrary data. Okay, so what do I think about projects like Art World trying to bring legacy artists into Web3? Wow, a lot of feelings on that. I personally don't think artists should involve themselves with any experimental emerging technology of any kind unless it feels like it makes sense for their practice. If those artists had personal curiosity in involving themselves with the technology, or if they want to be transparent, which I don't see enough of, about the fact they're just doing it to make money, then it's fine. But it becomes a problem when, in my opinion, this is obviously my opinion, like when an artist is experimenting with the technology and saying it's for the sake of it and not about the money, if it is, or if it's like they're not interested in actually learning how to directly as the artist, with the artist's hand, make something related to that technology. Art World also is in an interesting position. It almost didn't exist anymore. It was just recently saved by one of the founders, but that model wasn't working, is what I'm trying to say. Also, it's like the market doesn't even want that.
I'm sorry, Regina, you were saying the model doesn't want what?
The model doesn't want what Art World is giving them. At least that's what we're seeing. No one's buying what Art World is doling out. And in fact, after everything, I was just talking to someone about this before this class, is the whole Sam Bankman-Fried situation has tanked the entire cryptocurrency market in a way that's never fully recovered, and that's affecting artists as well, if we're going to talk from a market perspective. Also, I should say that I'm friends with the founders of most of these companies, and I love the Art World people, but I'm just going to say it how I see it.
Hi, I wonder if you could speak a little bit just on your personal feelings about these hybrid art that might have still really tangible or old school, old form structures, but then also tie into DWeb. Are there projects you think that are really informative in that sense, where they marry the tactile and to the ephemeral?
Yeah, I probably should have included it. Again, there's so many projects and I wanted to get through broader concepts, but Plantoid, the Primavera de Filippi work's such a good early example of that, where it includes, if someone can link it, a sculpture, this really robotic looking sculpture of a plant that is directly related to feeding it. I think at the time it was a Bitcoin. I think maybe it can take Ethereum now. It's like this concept of what does it mean for an object to ask to be taken care of autonomously, the object speaking for itself, and then asking of its collectors to feed it and to continue funding it and take care of it. And Terra Zero does that a little too, if I'm using the examples I've already brought up. The idea of Terra Zero as a DAO, it's a DAO, is what does it mean if the trees, if the environment can ask of us to take care of it using analytics, right? It's speaking for itself. So all of their installations include some kind of plants directly in the space, and there's something tangible about that. But from a technical perspective, the idea of registering a tangible work to a blockchain doesn't afford it anything in terms, of course, of permanence, but conceptually, it, of course, as any media artwork, has merits. Man, one project I should have talked about because of us educators is Sarah Friend's project. Did Sarah ever talk about her work?
I don't think so, but I was just thinking about bringing that one up too. Although I don't know how good a job I could do to explain it.
So, forgetting the name of the piece, and it's Life Forms is the one I'm thinking of. So, Sarah Friend has this amazing, simple project. It's amazing because it is simple. It's called Life Forms because when you purchase the NFT, if you don't transfer it to somebody else in an allotted period of time, it dies. So, by purchasing it, you are agreeing to steward this piece and take care of it by transferring it. There are people, most of the life forms are dead. You should probably ask her about it directly. She's sad about it, of course. Most of the life forms are dead, but those who still have it, they make calendar invites and alarms to remind themselves when the time is coming up so they can transfer back and forth to each other to keep it alive. And I think this is really important because it also asks this wider question around speculation. It's okay, are you in it to make money? Or are you in it to actually take care of this work, to be a steward of collecting art? And I think the statistics on how people treat life forms says a lot.
Are there any current projects or like places that you feel are attempting to steward art in a way that feels more aligned with the principles that I feel like you've been teaching us in this class? Because I feel like pretty much everyone you've shot down, you're like, this is just hype and this is this. So I'm just curious if there's any that are actually working in the sort of something that you feel, okay, yeah, this would be something to watch or something to participate even, something that we could all participate.
Yeah, so the project that Kalani's working on with Transfer Data Trust and the way it's involving Filecoin as a layer 1 blockchain to some extent, it's so focused on documentation and creating archival information packages and all these things. I would keep watching that, especially because it's going to probably take 2 years before it's really out there, but a lot of that documentation is being open source. What else? When I work with artists directly, we create that kind of documentation. I call it a pre-minting process. I probably spoke about this in the workshop, but I know a lot of you couldn't attend, where you create the archival information package first that really has the context and the detailed metadata and the archival files, etc. And you put that on IPFS first, you generate the hash, and then you include that when you mint to work on one of these platforms in your description. So it's tied to that. And then you always have access to it from there, right? So that's like a solution I've done on a case-by-case basis with artists like Araya Harvey and I don't know, I'm forgetting her name right now. She has a big show coming up with Guggenheim. I did this with the Namjoon Paik estate at one point with some major artists, but it's not no platform is doing this like at that level. Have I tried to advise platforms like Feral File on doing this? Yes, but they sometimes, just like we've talked about in these classes, like to ask for that much documentation, and you're not a gallery. You're asking for artists to do quite a bit of labor. You're asking institutions that aren't used to doing this kind of unsexy work to commit labor to that. But yeah, Feral File in general, I would say you can collect a zip file from them, and they do tend to put more metadata. So I have a lot of respect for especially the Feral File 1.0 and A2P, which is a project that predated Feral File that is part of that lineage. Yeah, they're doing an okay job. And then Tonic. Tonic is it's basically just this one person, Susanna, who's running it. But because of her background in Gagosian and other institutions, she's treating it like a gallery. That's why I brought up those examples, but I'd always be really cautious.
Yeah, the thing is, even though these kinds of projects and spaces and these concepts have been around for now some time, it still somehow feels very new. It still somehow feels very like it's still baking, like it's still forming, like there's still like a lot of hype. And that's one thing that I think we all really cared about putting into this particular program, is that there's many places where you can learn about NFTs, blockchain technology, crypto, decentralized, Web3, but there's not a lot of places where we can have like critical, sober discussions about it. And it's not just for the sake of being negative, and we're not just like haters because we're all like involved in some way or another. It's just like, why can't we just have these like critical conversations about it? And I guess one way you could look at it is, yeah, sounds like we can't really recommend too many spaces for you to go to yet that are maybe like that would meet all the criteria and the ideals that we've put forth in this program. But the other side of that coin is there's a huge opportunity still to make those spaces and to make those projects. And I think that will happen. It happened with the web too, with the early web. The early web was also very speculative and ridiculous, and also some really amazing moments.
The
but also
difference is, though, Sarah, is that the web is useful. And that ultimately, when you really take away all of the hype around blockchain, the question is really how useful is it? Or could these systems actually just be adopted outside of the use of this particular software?
But I would argue that I remember maybe in the late 90s, like seeing the first commercial van that had a website printed on it. And I remember people thinking like, that's so dumb. Like, who's going to buy clothing off a website? Who's going to buy groceries from a website? Like, it just seemed totally dumb. No one would ever do it. So that's why I'm okay. I'm not going to say it's one-to-one, but I'm going to keep an open mind because I remember when the web went through this, and I remember even myself thinking like I would never buy groceries off the web, and I do it every week. It's surprising how things can suddenly become useful. I don't know.
We only have 10 minutes. I wonder if anybody has more questions on this class, please feel free to ask them. But we also wanted to give a little time for discussion on your projects. We thought that would be relevant and a kind of a way to close this out. If anybody wants to share what they're working on, because it might be like a month or two before we all come together again for that showcase. You have to talk to the admins about that. I don't know where we're at with that schedule. This is like a nice little free period for that.
Before we jump into that, I do have a question. Is there anyone or who could we talk to see if we want to opt in to some sort of roster sharing? I feel like there's so many interesting people in the class.
Yeah.
And I would love to have some methodology to be able to like directly connect to some of the people in class, because we've been so focused on the course, we haven't had that opportunity. But I haven't found a place or anywhere where even if we could leave our email or something like that, so that there's just a way for us to address each other directly, because it seems like this is a very potent group of people, and it would be really nice to have that ability to cross-pollinate after the class.
Yeah, I don't know if Sarah and I can speak to that because we're not organizing the program. We're the educators. However, I will say that for those who have used the feedback form so far, the most consistent feedback we've got is that you all want that. You all want a sense of community between all of you. And I know that the admin team has heard that, and hopefully they can follow up with, yeah, some way for you all to connect. And one thing I'm thinking about, again, I'm just an educator, but of course we have feedback into the program, is in the next, maybe it's about keeping the matrix chat open, or even when we have a new cohort next year, it doesn't mean we're kicking you guys out of the matrix chat. Maybe it's just continued growing group of individuals who are really interested in this subject. So that's my 2 cents. But Sarah, I don't know if you had anything more to say on that.
No, unfortunately not. I agree with you. There's been so much like exciting energy, and it's been so great even as an educator to teach to all you, and just hearing how, I don't know, like sometimes as a teacher, like I know the things I care about and I get lost in my own teaching world, and I'm sometimes surprised that people other than me care about this stuff too. So anyway, it's been really great. And I did actually drop my email in the chat because, just speaking for myself, like I sincerely am interested in all the projects that you're working on, especially the ones who I've already met with, so I know the details. So feel free to reach out to me. That I'm totally happy to have your contact. I think that this will definitely be something that we as the educator team discuss. How can we, form a community that can stay in touch with each other going forward? I think because it's, our first time running this program, we're learning a little bit as we go. If you haven't filled out the feedback form yet, that's certainly something. If you did have any ideas or suggestions, or just wanted to let us know how you would be comfortable being contacted or engaged, let us know that, and that'll help us a lot.
If I could poke at the concept of DWeb camp. Has anybody here gone? Okay, so basically, it's in California, sorry, and the Internet Archive has been putting on these DWeb gatherings for many years, and the last 4 years are DWeb camp. And you can make friends for life there, and I highly recommend it, but it's like drinking from a fire hose, like this particular group. And boy, this year I'm going to not be a volunteer, but it's great when you're a volunteer because people come up to you and say thank you. This is one of the greatest experiences of my life. Now, I don't make any money off this, but thankfully Filecoin is allowing Internet Archive employees to go and not pay $1,300. But there are those, we really encourage people from out of the United States to come and participate, and it is, I've talked to some amazing artists there, and I really want to push that. The +1 for, I was going to ask about which communities do we go to from here, and I looked at the Tezos site, and there's something called WAC Weekly, Web3 Arts and Cultures. Has anybody gone to that?
Yeah, so I could talk about that. So I'm a contributor to that as well. I've been a mentor and an educator for that program for 2 seasons. That was started by DWeb. by a foundation called We Are Museums. It was for many years like heavily sponsored by Tezos, but now it's a little bit more, it has a bunch of different sponsors, and it's not just about Tezos. And there it is, they tend to meet, they have seasons, but they tend to meet on Wednesdays. I'm actually speaking on May 15th. If you want to just hear me rehash talking about, I don't even know, I forgot what I'm talking about that week. The program is overall focused on getting institutions educated specifically on how they can interact with blockchain. It is much more blockchain focused. However, I spoke to Deanne recently and she's aware of this program and she's interested in, because we're open sourcing this, she's interested in sharing these recordings with the WAC group. And so there's a lot of simpatico with that there, but I will maybe try to see if I could forward links so that you could sign up for those Wednesday talks. I know we're reaching the end of their season now. It's a little bit more hypey sometimes, the people they invite, but again, it's a conversation and they're definitely open to critical voices, or they would have kicked me out by now. They also have publications, so you can read kind of summary publications and download them from previous seasons that I can also link if one of the administrators can remind me. But this is how like Acme and Australia and the Musée d'Orsay and all these kind of institutions have gotten involved with, for better or for worse, blockchain. I don't necessarily agree with the projects, but it's through WAC. Yeah. There was something else that Kalani also brought up to me recently that could be interesting, but I have to also look into it more before I can like fully recommend it. It's called Bit Curator. Is anybody familiar with that? That's also a potential forum to talk about decentralization and media arts that isn't so blockchain focused. More links. All right, yeah, we're at 4 o'clock. Sorry that we didn't get to share projects with each other, but I know that the showcase is coming in the future, and I hope that Roxy and admins will facilitate more opportunities for that. And also, I talked to Roxy about how maybe closer to the showcase date, we'll put in some more office hours. I know that I want to, and obviously Sarah already gave you her email, but a lot of us are open to adding extra office hours in the coming month.
Yeah, and for me, my schedule is pretty dynamic, which means that sometimes just contacting me directly to make a meeting works better than having fixed office hours. So that's just how my life flows. Yeah, like I said, reach out if you want. We can find a time. It might not be that week, it might be the following week, but I'll make time. It won't be like a month out, I promise.
Thank you both so much for today's session. It was truly a lovely way to wrap up the course. And so maybe it did fall exactly where it needed to. And yeah, we really appreciate it.
Welcome. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Gosh, I don't know. I feel sad.
Yeah, I know it's the end. It's basically the end.
It's not really the end. Yeah.
Thank you all.
I came in this super cold and I learned a lot. It was pretty great.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for being yourselves. Thank you for being geniuses at the things you're passionate about. And thank you for being present with us. It was really fun for me.
Agreed. Thank you so much.
You. All right. I hope to hear from some of you soon and see your projects at some point. Yeah. Okay.
You're all awesome. Bye.
Yes. Good night, everyone. Or for me, good night. Bye.